So, I watched Halloween for the first time. This is a film from 1978 by John Carpenter, someone who I have not experienced up to this point. I haven't seen The Thing. I haven't seen Big Trouble in Little China or They Live or Escape from New York. I'm also interested in checking out Prince of Darkness and In the Mouth of Madness. Pretty much most of his filmography I'm interested in, just because his stature is quite strong, or reportedly quite strong from many opinions in the cinema space. I think he's viewed sort of as one of the auteurs from that era, especially someone who has a very distinct mark within their films. Like, you know that it's a Carpenter flick when you're watching it. And as I experience more of his films, I'll be curious to see if I also pick up on that or not. But yeah, this was my first experience watching Halloween, and I think first off what I realized is maybe I should have waited till Halloween night or Halloween day, whatever, to watch this. I think it's probably a movie that benefits from matching it with its internal setting, right? Because it's a movie that's, other than a prologue, entirely set on Halloween day, October 31st. So, come back to me around that time, and I probably will have rewatched it and maybe have a different opinion on the film, because I have to be honest and say that this was just an okay experience for me. I'd say probably a 3 out of 5 type deal, and I'll kind of go into why. A little bit more background though. I'm interested to learn how much of this movie was influenced by like Italian horror. I know from my brief kind of research into that topic that Italian horror was kind of growing in the 60s and 70s especially, and more specifically like giallo horror was becoming prevalent in that same kind of time period, and that uses the slasher elements often in those types of movies that we would come to find in movies like Halloween and Scream and movies in that ilk on the other side of the ocean, here in the States. So I'm curious to read, I think, maybe how much Carpenter was influenced by those sources, and also to myself, look into those sources, because I have very little experience with that kind of sector of film, and it'll be interesting to kind of compare some of those elements. But let me start off with what I did like about Halloween, and I think the strongest part of it for me was the sense of setting. One thing I noticed early was, other than the prologue, which I would include both, the initial introduction to young Michael Myers and his stabbing of his sister, into the first shot after that, which is Loomis and the other driver, driving up to the mental hospital where Michael has been kept for the past 15 years and ends up escaping from. That's kind of like the prologue of the film in my mind. And then we get introduced to Laurie and Haddonfield. But what I noticed was, for roughly the first 30 minutes, we see Haddonfield in the daytime, right? All the shots are during the day of, Halloween day, not Halloween night. And at first this sort of surprised me, because I didn't exactly know what I was getting with this movie. I mean, obviously there's parts of this movie that are so ubiquitous, like that intro and ending theme, which are awesome, and also Michael Myers as a villain. He's so ubiquitous as far as people dressing up for him for Halloween and other things. But other than that, my understanding of what goes on in this movie was pretty much nothing. So at first I was like, oh, interesting. We're like, this just seems like a movie that would just be at night. But then I realized, like, when we transitioned into that first shot at night, right at about like the 35-minute mark, it was that much more stark via contrast because we had been introduced to this place during the day. So it kind of lended the suburban area that sense of normalcy that we associate with, suburbia, only for it to be then thrown into darkness and have that contrast where it's like, well, these places are fine enough in the day, it's just a normal place, but what might they hold at night? And it really was effective. Now it's like that tree in the daytime was no big deal, but now that tree looks ominous. What's behind the trunk of the tree? What's down by the light post? What's waiting alongside one of these houses, as the houses dot the landscape. So I really thought that was effective. And I think generally Carpenter's camera work in this movie is really effective. The way that he'll use different sorts of shots, different types of movement, different framing was pretty consistently great throughout the whole movie. I mean, you go from like kind of long tracking shots of Laurie walking during the day to shots of her looking down from a window, seeing Michael out in the hedges, and just the way that used verticality and space I thought was really effective. And then you have shots like at the end, there's that iconic shot where all of a sudden Laurie's in that house where she discovers the bodies, and all of a sudden his face kind of slowly materializes out of the blackness behind her. And like shots like that are just so well composed. Or then another shot a little bit later where she's in kind of the threshold of the door, and Michael, who she's just stabbed in the chest with the knife, is laying on the ground, supine, is that what that is, on his back? Is that the word? He's laying down, and he slowly gets up with her in the foreground, and just stuff like that, and that's like peppered throughout the whole movie. And so on that level, I think it's quite excellent. Unfortunately, then we start to kind of get into some of the negative, where like there was this constant pattern in that first hour where it was Michael stalking Laurie and her friends and things like that, right? So we get the normal suburban activity thing, oh, they're walking along the street, or oh, she's in a classroom, or oh, they're driving in their car smoking weed. Okay. And then we'd get the music cue, because then we get a shot of Michael stalking them in some fashion, whether that be on foot or in another car, and the music would come in, which was great. But then there'd be a moment of they would realize, or she would realize, and then she'd go, oh, wait, what's this? And then wouldn't find anything, and then she'd be like, oh, it's fine. And that same kind of sequence repeats 8, 10, 9, 10 times, who knows how many times in that first hour. And for me personally, I think I could recognize the craft of it and how each one of those was getting sharper than the next, or than the last, I should say. But I just started to kind of get bored, like, of that sequence, and it stopped having, I think, the desired impact on me as a viewer. So that kind of balanced out a little bit, and then unfortunately, whereas I think the first hour is quite good, we get into the last 30 minutes, which for me just kind of turned into like lame slasher that I was not super keen on. Like, there's some great moments in there, but as a whole, just really lost steam with it. I do think, like I said, I already called out a few of the great shots. I do think another great moment is Michael stabbing Bob and pinning him to the thing, and that's all fine, but the real great part is him just like surveying this body. I heard another reviewer say it was like he's looking at a painting like it's a great Matisse or something, and I thought that was a really great way to put it, a phrasing, I suppose. But my problem is that I don't find him very scary at all. I think he just is sort of like an ambling you know, buffoon type. I don't know. It doesn't, not buffoon. That's the wrong word, but just like kind of this like slow ambulatory figure that I gotta be honest, just never really moved the needle for me. And I mean, at no point in this movie did I feel anything even approaching fear. And I don't know if that's where I'm at with horror films. Like, I don't even know if there's films that would do that for me. I imagine there are, because there's a lot of movies out there. But my experience with horror movies is pretty limited, especially recently. Like, horror movies that I would watch, I watched those 5-6 years ago, and I haven't really been watching them in the interim. So this is kind of my first foray back into like horror flicks. So I don't know if that's just something that I've lost, or if there are still movies that can just kind of curdle my blood or get me really tense. But I gotta say, this movie was not like that. I mean, I watched it alone at night. Maybe if I had a better sound system, maybe that really would have ratcheted up the terror. But that was another thing where I never even really felt the tension. And so what I was left with was to kind of admire it as an academic piece, right? When I talk about camera movement, when I talk about these things, like, those are well and good, and those can, I think, influence my opinion of a movie, but those aren't like visceral things necessarily. Those can create visceral moments, but like, the camera work in and of itself usually isn't the thing that's gonna wow me about a movie necessarily. It has to like coalesce with something else for me to really praise either part of it, right? And so I was just kind of left to throw up my hands. And yeah, I gotta say, I was actually between kind of like a 5 or 6 out of 10. I went with a 6 just because of some of the better parts of it. But yeah, it was a little on the middling side, I gotta say. But I definitely understand. I think I understand the place that it has kind of in horror media and the imagery that it provided. And as far as the setting goes, I want to say one more positive thing, which is it is so interesting to see a movie like this set in suburbia, right? I was thinking on this a little bit, and I feel like, both the countryside and the city are ripe for kind of horror themes and things like that, right? You have the isolation, maybe even the desolation of the countryside, old farmhouses and open fields and decrepit manors and things like that. Totally makes sense, especially like minimal light pollution, so you get the guise of the moon and all of that. And then you have the city, which has a grime to it, a dog eat dog type mentality, cutthroat, a punky aesthetic that seems ripe for another type of horror. And that kind of that middle child is the suburbs, right? What do you do with that? But it turns out there's all kinds of anxieties that you can play with when it comes to suburbia. Kind of the general distrust of neighbor to neighbor sometimes, even though it's supposed to be, a community, which we see in the movie, right? She goes up to one of the doors and is denied any help. They just like turn their back to her. And just the juxtaposition of the suburbs are supposed to be the safe place. They're a place of low crime and all of these other things. They're usually rather affluent and things like that. But then you get a situation like this where a person like Michael Myers, a psychotic individual, is running rampant and killing people left and right. So I also thought that was pretty interesting as well. But really, those last 30 minutes were what kind of took it down for me and made it just an okay experience. So I'll be curious to check out more of Carpenter's work. I do hope that The Thing and like They Live and those movies work for me more. And I am excited to revisit this in the future. We'll see. Maybe come this Halloween, I'll be singing its praises like so many others.